Recording. Okay, we'll get started with Paulette. Welcome.
Thank you. Well, thank you for inviting me here, and thank you for giving me this opportunity to share my book with you, my translated book with you. I'm going to start by sharing the screen and show you a PowerPoint first. Let's start right here. Slideshow. So the name of my book is, the book I translated is Boston, My Blissful Winter, Memories of the 1980s. And during this presentation, I'm going to talk about the book, about the author, about the translator myself, but I'm just going to go over that pretty quickly because most of you have read the bios and the publicity that was put out by the library, and that was quite extensive. Thank you very much, Falmouth Library. Then I'll go through chapters 1 through 12 in a pictorial synopsis of each story. The next section is the Rotary connection, and what does Rotary do? What is the connection with this book? And as Sue mentioned, she'll ask some questions. You'll have the opportunity to ask questions also. And a lot of the questions might be answered as I go through the text. So let's just get started here. So about the book, the title of the book is Boston, My Blissful Winter, Memories of the 1980s. And it's 12 short stories about a young French banker who has been assigned as an intern in a Boston bank and is experiencing Boston for the first time. He visits many different venues and he meets people from different backgrounds. Now, recently, I was telling an acquaintance about the book and she interrupted me and said, Paulette, I lived in Boston for years and I never found winter in Boston blissful. I had to laugh because I had to agree in some way. When you think of the snow and the people shoveling places to save their place and dirty snow. But if you look at the bottom of the screen, part of the Kirkus review says, Brunch achieves a magic that only visitors from another culture are usually capable of. He takes the familiar and through his unjaded perspective, makes it seem exotic and remarkable. A highly pleasant collection of episodes set in a vanished Boston. And this here is a picture of the author, Alain Brunch, taken in 1989. And this is a picture of the author currently. I'm not going to read all of this, but he had a career his whole career was in French diplomacy at many different levels, including ambassador to France in many different countries all over the world. And he was Consul General of France in Boston from 1985 to 1990. Now, he loved Boston so much, but the usual term of office for a Consul General is 3 years. He was able to convince his superiors to let him stay for 5. And when he left Boston, he was assigned to Rangoon and wrote this in 1994 when he was in Rangoon. It's written as a fiction, and these stories are fiction, but it's fiction based on real experiences in Boston and during those 5 years. So about me, I'm not going to go into my bio, but you can find it. You can find details about my bio on my website. But the question is, how and why did I start translating this book? Well, shortly after the French book was published, it was published in 2007, even though he had written in 1994. The author asked me if I would translate the book or if I could find someone to translate it. And at the time, I had my own business. I was a small business owner providing administrative services to nonprofit professional organizations. And I was very busy, and there was no way I could get into this project at the time. So over the years, Anna, the author, and I maintained, we corresponded or we kept in touch over the years. And if he were in Boston, we might meet for a cocktail or lunch. And if I were in Paris, we would meet. So let's fast forward. I had told him that I couldn't do this. Now I'm retired. So we fast forward to 2014. And my husband and I met the author, for a drink. And I asked him if he had found anyone to translate his book. And when he said no, I said, I'd like to try just to keep up with my French language skills. So he said, well, do the first chapter and send it to me, which I did. And he replied, continuez. And that's how I started. Now, in the first story, late one Sunday afternoon in winter, we find the French intern's initial reaction to Boston while sitting at a cafe on a snowy afternoon at the corners of Chestnut and Charles Street in Boston. From there, he observes many different people passing by, and we read his reflections about their different personalities. A few he has met since arriving in Boston, and others that are part of his imagination. The reader is also introduced to Beacon Hill, Commonwealth Avenue, Back Bay, and the author's fascination with the flashing lights on the John Hancock Tower that forecast the weather. In chapter 2, the story of a t-shirt and a mother's love, it's Saturday morning, and the banker is preparing a speech that he must give at Faneuil Hall to announce the winner of an ice sculpture in the shape of the Statue of Liberty. It's 1986, the centennial celebration of the Statue of Liberty, which was a gift to the United States from France. His secretary, a Christian Scientist who has been asked to come in on Saturday to type his speech, brings her young son with her. And she reveals her opinions about politics in Boston at the time. Dukakis was running for president. Bonnie Frank had just come out of the closet. And do you know the significance of this grasshopper on the top of Faneuil Hall? This here is a picture of 2 Commonwealth Avenue. This is where the French consulate was. And the consulate was on the first floor and the second floor, and on the third floor, this is where the author lived, at 2 Commonwealth Avenue. In the third story, The Feast of Kings, the intern is invited to a dinner to celebrate the Feast of the Magi, a typical French tradition where a galette or a cake is served. There's a bean in the cake, and whoever has the slice of cake with the bean or the pea is the king or the queen for the day. The hosts are a French-American couple who met in Paris during the liberation of France. Sorry about this. Go back to the next one. Here we go. Who met in Paris during the liberation of France. We learn about the challenges of war brides who became expatriates to marry American soldiers after World War II, and the difficulties of sustaining 2 different cultures as part of their life. Reading this chapter, you'll be reminded of the typical home furnishings of the time, the overstuffed furniture, and remember those big console TVs. And remember that craze, what's your color, where women were advised what color clothing they should wear based on their hair coloring and their skin tone or their eyes. I love that section. It really makes me laugh because it brings me back there. So as in many of these stories in this book, there is a surprise ending, as in this one. I think this is one of my favorite stories because I lived in Quincy, and the setting is right here on Quincy Shore Drive, where Madeleine and Paul, the main characters, live, and the story ends at the Quincy Adams station. But as I said, I'm not telling you the ending. There we go. Chapter 4, Harvard Square. Miles Davis's record album, Around Midnight, is playing on the radio at the beginning and at the ending of this story. The reader takes a car trip in the pouring rain from Bay Village to the International Newspaper Kiosk in Harvard Square to purchase the early morning edition of the Boston Sunday Globe. Have you ever driven from the South Shore of the Mass Turnpike to Harvard Square and in the rain? Do you remember the Mass Turnpike extension, where you have to take that exit and there are 5 roads coming in, and then you have to take a left onto Starrow Drive to the Anderson Bridge to get to Harvard Square? Well, I worked in Cambridge for a while, and the vivid description in this chapter always reminds me of the stress of driving this trip. And historically, did you know that this kiosk here at Harvard Square was removed a couple of years ago? We learn of Jack Kerouac's childhood in Lowell, his relationship to his mother, some of the people he knew, and in particular his friend, Father Morissette. The occasion is a talk organized by Allen Ginsberg and Gregory Corso in a tribute to Kerouac. We visit the homes, churches, and play areas of Kerouac's childhood and the cemetery where he's buried. On this particular trip, accompanied by a friend from Boston who only knows of Lowell's poverty and misery, we learn about the rich heritage and struggles of the French Canadian inhabitants and their community leaders. In this story, we meet a young couple, both musicians. Shortly after a concert at the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum, we learn of their separation, initiated by the young woman's opportunity to advance her career in Philadelphia. The museum, beautifully described during the holiday season, and the reasons behind the separation serve as a springboard to reveal and discuss Boston's conservatism in regard to accepting contemporary art and music in the 1980s. Both the intern and the young musician reflect on the strength and power of temporary acquaintances and the impact they can have on a person's life. Uncle Charles is 80 years old. He's lived a full, healthy life, and after a stay at Mass General, he's now enmeshed in reflections about the end of his life. As his very last living wish, Uncle Charles asks to be driven to the ocean at Manchester by the Sea, also known as the Singing Beach. Although reluctant at first, through a chance encounter with a stranger, on his way to Boston College, the stranger speaks of the ocean as a force leading to God, and the banker recognizes his role in Uncle Charles' destiny and in his final days. For those of you who are old enough, do you remember the private male clubs in Boston that excluded the presence of women? This period is examined through a luncheon invitation to the Somerset Club at a time when the Supreme Court had just ruled that discriminating against women in any form is forbidden. The author gives a wonderful description of the staid and formal atmosphere of the club and its members. Venturing to the Ritz for Sunday brunch, the intern joins a couple he had met briefly at a recent reception at the French Library. The exuberant and vivid dialogue of the older woman and her younger male companion explores some of the conservative and traditional customs again in Boston in the 80s, such as the issue of gender and age discrimination in the workplace, tea dances, Sunday brunch at the Ritz. Now, the reason I included this picture here of the dancers is because during the story, there is the mention of the lambada and the paso doble, which reminded me of my own dancing days in the 80s, when these dances were popular. So some people who have read the book already have given me feedback. And the feedback that I get from most people is that they like looking at reading about the different places, they like the stories, but the places often trigger their own personal experiences and their own personal memories. The Blue Diner, as the intern and two of his friends venture into Cambridge to listen to jazz, many of the 1980s popular jazz clubs and artists are talked about. The different personalities of each character is revealed through their music preferences, and we discover how their lives support each other through friendship. Since the music is not to their liking, they decide to leave. They leave the concert and travel through the very descriptive wintry Charles River scenery of Cambridge and Charlestown to the Blue Diner, a landmark near South Station. Comparing the end of winter to their relationships, they're reminded that soon they will be separated. Almost all the chapters, as I mentioned, triggered past memories for me, and this one especially. My son was working in New York, and I didn't see him very often. But one day he had a business trip to Boston, and before heading back, we met for an early dinner at the Blue Diner, just near South Station, before he took the train to go back to New York. But now the Blue Diner is still there, but it's no longer called the Blue Diner. It's called the South Street Diner. Remembering Sarah Vaughan. The banker learns of Sarah Vaughan's death on the radio in a taxi ride to Cambridge. During the ride, the author describes the glacial days of a northeaster in March. The news of Sarah Vaughan's death projects the author into memories of her voice, tonality, the music, and his favorite songs, which he sadly compares to his upcoming departure from Boston. And in this last story, the young intern sees a painting of a young boy in an antique shop, Marika on Charles Street, which is still there, by the way. He becomes obsessed with this painting and introspective about his own childhood, about his stay in Boston, which has been too short, and about the lessons he has learned about life. Because the price, he hesitates and is reluctant to buy the portrait. When he finally decides to pay the asking price, the painting has already been sold. So I'm not going to tell you what happens next, but there's a parallel with the painting and his life and his departure from Boston. What's the meaning of this portrait in the intern's life? How does it fit into the lessons he's learned and what the beautiful harsh winter in Boston has taught him? So that's the end of the book. And what does Rotary International have to do with all of this? First of all, do you know what Rotary International is? Well, Rotary International is a group of people. We're people of action. We're not couch potatoes. And we do good in the world. What do we mean by world? It's not only the third world countries and foreign countries. It's right here in our own community, in Falmouth, in Weymouth, in the greater Boston area. And we are making a difference. So Rotary is a group of people of action doing good in the world and making a difference. And what's the connection? How is the book connected to Rotary? Well, after I had done the translation, when I was looking for a publisher, I used the ALTA, which is the American Literary Translators Association's publishers database. And I sent out about at least 20 to 30 query letters. After many, many rejections, I received calls from 2 publishers, or 2 of them were interested. And one of them was very, very persistent, and she kept calling me. Finally, I Googled her, and I Googled her company, which was PRA Publishing. And it's a small publishing company in Georgia. And I discovered not only is she a Rotarian, but she was a past president of her club. So meanwhile, I had taken on the responsibility as an executive assistant to our incoming district governor. And this commitment was a 2 to 2.5 year commitment. So I told her that I couldn't do anything for 2 years, that I had to put it on the side shelf, and I really wasn't going to stop publishing right now. And she understood because she was a Rotarian. And also the author, who had just come back from giving a talk to a Rotary club in Montreal, I told him I couldn't work on it for a couple of years. And so he understood. And Rotary has a different theme every year. And last year it was Rotary Connects the World. And this year it's Rotary Opens Opportunities. So I see this book, my translation, is connecting me to the world, connecting me to Georgia, to Montreal, to France, and opening opportunities. This book opened opportunities for me, and it also opened opportunities for my publisher. So now we're going to talk about the process from text to print. And I think Sue has questions, or if there are any questions in the chat yet, or I can just mention the questions that some people have asked me before and answer them. Sue, is there anything on, or do you want to? You're muted. You're muted, Sue. Sue, you're muted.
Yeah, okay, I get, sorry. Okay, yeah, there aren't any questions in the chat yet. I will start asking some of the questions we've prepared. But the first question I want to skip ahead to is, where can people find the book?
Oh, all right. Well, people can find the book. Well, they're at the library. Let me go ahead to, I have them all listed here. Whoops, let's go back. Sorry.
Oh, good. Okay.
Previous. There we are. So they're at the book is at 8 Cousins of Falmouth, and the book's at 8 Cousins of Signed. So those are signed books. If you want it personalized, you can contact me, and I will, or contact 8 Cousins and tell them that you want to have it personalized to your own name, and I'll do that and get the book to them. Market Street Bookshop in Mashpee also has the book. If you're not from the area and you have a favorite bookstore, you can ask your favorite bookstore to order it. However, there have been some few delays and some issues with that. So if your favorite bookstore can't get it, please let me know. And because we're trying to resolve some issues with that. Your local libraries, as we mentioned, has it. It's in the CLAM system. There are a couple of copies there. You can email me at pauletteBoudreau@gmail.com, and I will send you a book. They cost $15 plus the shipping, so it comes to about $18. There's a site called bookbaby.com where you can get it. And of course, you can get it at the big retail distributions such as Barnes and Nobles and Amazon. And if you go to my website, there are also reviews on the book, more very detailed bios on the author and myself, even recorded excerpts from some of the chapters, events, contacts, and purchase links. And I'm available if you would like me to give this presentation and talk with your book club. I'm available for that, or to any of your organizations. So I'm going to stop.
One quick question. Can I ask you, someone wanted to know about your accent. They noticed maybe a New York accent.
My accent is from, well, I was born in Fall River. And you're probably you're not hearing a Boston accent, but you're hearing a Fall River accent, which is close to Rhode Island. So I was born, I'll tell you a little bit about my background. I was born in a third generation in a French-Canadian family. And I'm the oldest of 5 children. When I was, and how I learned French, when I was born, my parents spoke to me in French, but after the second and third child came along, they stopped doing that. And so we didn't speak French in the family, but we did speak French when we went to my grandparents' house, which we went to quite frequently on Sundays and especially at holidays. And at the holidays, all the grandchildren were asked to either say recite a poem or sing a song or do something. If we did it in French, my grandfather gave us a quarter, but if we did it in French, we only got a dime. So that's how one of the things that really kept me going in French. I don't know, do you want to hear about the rest of how I really got to mastering the French? And actually, yes. I went to, in addition to that, so that was the beginning. In addition to that, I went to parochial Catholic Canadian schools where the nuns spoke French. We had French classes. We also had religion in French and some of our activities in French. And when I got to high school, that was through elementary and high school, by the time I graduated from high school, I remember saying on graduation day, I hate French. I'm never going to speak French again in my life. And then I went to college. And when I got to college, it was shortly after Sputnik. And in those days, all the methodology in teaching foreign languages had switched from reading and writing to speaking and understanding French. And I had a mentor. My first mentor was I decided to take French as an elective because I figured, well, easy credits, I can go through graduation. And the professor we had a French-Canadian background. There were only 6 students in the class, and she was very powerful in encouraging us to, one, change our accent from the Canadian accent to the French accent, and also encouraging us to go into teaching, which I was majoring in elementary education. but FLES meaning foreign languages in the elementary schools because of Sputnik had just taken hold in that period of time. And she guaranteed that we would get a job right away, which I did. And I taught in the elementary schools in one of the 3 communities in Massachusetts that had a full-time FLES program, and that was in Northampton, Massachusetts. And there, the department chairman encouraged me to go to Middlebury and take my master's because he was teaching a methodology class there. So I went to Middlebury, and that's where I really learned to fall in love with French and fall in love with everything that had to do with French, and where I decided that I really wanted to spend a year in France. And I ended up doing that. It took me a little while to get there, but I did end up doing that. Okay, that's how I learned French. My accent is, and I have had, you ask about my accent, it is from Fall River and the Fall River, Rhode Island area, but I've had some French people or bilingual people, especially when I was working at the consulate and the cultural services, people I would meet at receptions and we only spoke French, and then having the occasion to speak English to them and hearing my accent, they said, oh my gosh, you speak better in French than you do in English. So, all right.
Actually, the next question, someone did ask this, and it sounds like one of the questions we prepared. Are there nuances in French which are not easily translated into English? Which is definitely another topic I know you're going to talk about, the difference between direct or literal translation.
Right. The whole process. So first of all, when I started the translation, after the author and I decided that I would do this, this was his first book to be translated, and it was my first translation. So I came back home and I started translating, and I do one chapter at a time and send it to him, and we'd email back and forth and go back and forth and back and forth. You know, I'd say something, I'd ask him something, and he'd say, no, that's not right. Then after about 4 or 5 months, or by the time I was almost all the way through the translation process, I got an email from Middlebury College, where I had gotten my master's, and they were saying that Breadloaf, which has a very famous writers conference, was having their first translators conference. So I decided to apply and was accepted into their workshop and spent a week, 10 days at the Breadloaf Translators Conference. And guess what? All that work we had done in 4 or 5 months had been literal translations, when I should have been doing literary translations. So what's the difference about between literal and literary? Well, literal is going just word for word. There are a lot of things that are different in the language structure. For example, the structure of the sentences is different. The verb tenses, there are verb tenses in French that don't exist in English. There's the present, the past. The French has a past tense that's called passé simple, which is a literal past that doesn't even exist. Contractions. The contractions in French do not exist. For example, we say, I'll go here, he's going there. And for them, if you translate it literally, it's I will go here, he will go there, they are going there. But in American English, we say he's going, I'm going. That's one of the differences. Another one of the differences. The other difference in translating is knowing your audience. You have to know who you're writing for. So the literal translation certainly was not meant to be for an American reader. So I had to put into my mind that I was going to be translating this for an American public and translating it into American English. Some things like slang are not really translatable. And that was 5 years ago that I had done this. So 5 years ago, I had a dictionary. I had a French and English dictionary, a French dictionary, a thesaurus, a dictionary of synonyms, and I was going back and forth into the books. Well, nowadays, and I don't know if it's because I was not that technically adept in those days, but nowadays there's Google, and there's also machine translations and computer-assisted translations that help you in the whole translation process. There's even a dictionary of slang, a French slang dictionary, or you can Google French slang translated into English. So that's part of the difference between literary and literal. One thing I learned while I was at Breadloaf was that I should have readers, and these are people who would read the chapters, and I came back and had readers read the chapter. I selected people who were were English majors in college, or who were English professors, or who really wrote English very well. And one of them, who was bilingual, read it, and she said, "Oh my gosh," she said, "I'm reading English words, but I feel like I'm reading French. I'm reading French structure." So maybe that explains more precisely the difference between literal translation and literary translation.
Okay. And let's see. Oh, and someone asked, what did you enjoy about working on the book, and what did you dislike?
Well, I enjoyed the whole process. There's the process of writing on the book, and then there's the after you finish the book, there's the whole publicity process. I liked finishing each chapter. I liked having each chapter finished and saying, "Oh, I got that part finished." But there's a whole process, and I can't say exactly because it was a long journey. It took me, if you ask me how long did it take, well, the process was 5 years. However, there's that 2.5-year period that I took off to do Rotary work. And so it really took about 3 years, but the process was a 3-year process. And each section, each part was a little different. The beginning part was working on my own, then getting readers to help me make some edits, and then working with the editor. Working with the editor was very interesting. The editor was a small editor, PRA Publishing, and Lucinda, the owner, I believe is on this call. I thought I saw her name here. She's a small company, and she outsources a lot of the process. And she outsourced the book cover, as a matter of fact. She outsourced it to Publishers Weekly. And the book cover, I had sent in some pictures of winter in Boston as suggestions for the book cover. But the graphic designer at Publishers Weekly actually designed the cover and used her design to teach and provide a seminar and quote and things for other graphic designers as to why she picked the certain colors, why it picked a certain font, about the size of the picture on the size of the statue on the cover. So that was one process. And this was even before we got to the editing process with the editor. So the editor even had me prepare a media kit. So all of this information about the author I had prepared ahead of time before we even got to the editing process. She also had me record some excerpts, which are on my website. So there were 4 different excerpts that are recorded to use for pre-publicity. And that was very interesting. The hardest part of the whole process, and this was finally, there was an editor who had been outsourced. And I worked with the editor, and I worked with her assistant, and we went back and forth. And finally, we had what we thought was the final copy, the final edited copy. So I sent that to Lucinda. Good, we've got the final edited copy done, all done. Well, Lucinda called me, and she said she was going to drop the 5th chapter about Kerouac. I was horrified. It was the author's favorite chapter. So I asked her why. And she said, well, it's very confusing. There are a lot of characters. It's just too confusing. And I thought about it for a while, and I had to agree. I said, yes, it is confusing. I said, the author is writing from a stream of consciousness. He's writing in the present. He's writing in the past. He's writing in the past perfect. There's even a dream sequence. I said, let me work on it some more before you decide whether or not you're going to drop it. So I started working on it, and I told the author that I was going to drop the dream sequence. And he said, well, no, you can't do that. That really happened. And I said, well, actually, the dream sequence really, there are a couple of reasons. The dream sequence doesn't add to the story. And also, I know it really happened, but this book is supposed to be fiction. So I think, that sometimes he got, how much of the book is fiction and how much is real, I'm not sure. I can't tell you that. I can tell you the places are real, but as far as and some of the characters I know, some of the characters are named and I know those people. Some of the characters have fictional names, but I know who they are. But as far as the incidents and the stories, I can't tell you what's fiction and what's not fiction. The author would have to tell you that. So to get back to the publication of the book and dropping that chapter, so we sent it, I sent my revised chapter to Lucinda, and she called back. She says, that's a lot better, but I'm still thinking about dropping it. Oh my gosh, I can't tell the author. And I had a plan B, but I said it was really very important for me to maintain a good relationship with the author and also with the publisher. So I remembered an acquaintance from the Société Francophone de Cape Cod, which I'm a member, who was a freelance editor. So Ellen Albanese, and I called her. I said, Ellen, would you take a look at this, see if there are any changes you can make or give me some advice. So she did. She made a few changes, and we talked about it, and she made some other changes. And I sent it, we sent that final chapter, decided on the final chapter on Kerouac, sent it to Lucinda. She called back. She loved it. She loved it so much that she hired Ellen to go over the whole manuscript again and put the final touches on the manuscript, on the book. So I thank Ellen because she really put the icing on the cake, as I would like to say. So that was, the whole process.
Okay, we have a couple more questions that came through, and this one's interesting. If the author worked here all these years, he must have spoken English. Why did he not want to do his own translation?
Well, whoever asked the question, are you bilingual? Is the person who asked the question a bilingual person? If you're not a bilingual person, you would know that. I don't consider myself actually bilingual because I'm not a native speaker. However, and I wouldn't even, up until recently, I haven't even attempted to translate something literary into French. I've translated a few things as friends, people in business, but if you're not a native speaker, it's hard to get just the nuances of the language. So the role of the translator is to take the source language, the original language, and put the nuances and translate it into a language that is understandable and maintain the voice and the culture for the reader, the American public in this particular case. So I think unless you're a really good native speaker or really a good speaker of the foreign language, you really would not attempt to translate, and he would not attempt to translate it to English. He knows English, but I think he was of that generation also who learned English when it was reading and writing. And I don't think he's very comfortable, speaking, although he did have to speak in English quite a bit when he was Consul General of France in Boston. I hope that answers your question. I hope that answers your question.
I think so. If you have any follow-ups, let us know. And someone asked you to read a little bit in French.
Oh, okay. I will read something. Let's see. I've got something here from, and this goes back to the difference between literal translation and, oops, sorry. There goes my screen. Whoops. I'm going to stop share screen here. So let's get this.
Yeah, you can do that.
There, and share screen. All right. I'm going to read, let's put this back up here on a full screen. All right. Is that better for everyone? Anyway, I'm going to read something that also ties in with literal and literary translation, and things that you cannot translate. So this is from the chapter on La Fête des Rois, the Feast of Kings. And it tells about how the main character, Madeleine, and her husband Paul met after the liberation of France. And the sentence says, il devait faire la connaissance de celle qui allait devenir sa femme à l'hôtel de ville lors d'une réception organisée par une association de marraines de guerre. Right, anyone on this who knows French, is that enough French for me to read for you? Anyway, les marraines de guerre, if you translate that literally it is the godmothers of war. What are the godmothers of war? I didn't know. We went back at least 2 or 3 times on, on emails for him trying to explain to me what les marraines de guerre was, because there was no translation in English. There was no concept in English. Now, as I said, I didn't use a computer then. Finally, what we decided on was to keep it in French. So in French, we just said they were at a reception at City Hall organized by an association of young women, comma, les marraines de guerre de Paris, comma, who corresponded with soldiers. So recently, now that I use Google more frequently, I went on Google and Google, if you Google something in the foreign language, the explanation comes up in the foreign language. I Googled les marraines de guerre de Paris. In 2 seconds, I found out that I would have found out then that these were just people who corresponded with soldiers. It started in World War I, was continued in World War II to help soldiers keep up their morale. But I was not doing that when I first started. So is that enough French, or do you want more French? Whoever asked that. That should be enough.
Okay, and let's see. I know you talked about self-publishing.
Okay, yeah, people ask me often, did you ever think about self-publishing? Well, my daughter is an author, and she has published 3 books. Her first book was self-published, and I had helped her through that whole process. And I knew from my experience with working with her that I did not want to go through the work of self-publishing.
Yeah. Okay, and now that the book is in print, what are you doing?
Well, years ago, the publisher was responsible for doing all the publicity and the promotion and marketing the book. That's not the case now. Now it's the author, or in this case, the translator, who needs to get involved, or I get involved. And it's a lot of work. So I've been contacting bookstores and organizations and trying to book virtual presentations. Thank you, the Falmouth Library. And I meet with my publisher once a week to discuss the progress and the opportunities for promoting books. I've also, which I said I would not try, but as a favor to someone, I've translated a poem from English to French and worked a little bit on a short story from English to French. But I have the author's second book, which is Sine Dei. It's about his father, who was a prisoner of war during World War II and was taken prisoner near the Baltic Sea in the Oflags, which are camps for prisoners. And it tells the story related in relationship to him and his father. He never knew his father till his father came back from the war, because he was an infant when his father was captured. And also from the mother who took the responsibility of the family and moved them to. Anyway, it's a story. I like the story a lot. And I started working on it about 2 or 3 years ago. So it's still sitting there, and I'd like to get back to it.
Oh, that's great. And by the way, the one reason I know you asked me to record this is because you wanted the author to be able to listen to it, and he wasn't able to make it to this.
Right, yes.
And
If there was anything else we had that I thought you might.
oh, one more question. How did the original book sell in France, his book?
I don't know. I don't know. I don't know how it sold it for him. I think it's doing pretty well here. I think the English book is doing pretty well here.
Yeah.
I have no idea how. I know it's hard. If you want a French copy, it's very difficult to get a French copy. It's really out of print. You might be able, if you keep checking on Amazon, you might be able to get once in a while a used copy comes up, I know I wanted to get some extra French copies because my original copy was all falling apart because I had used it so much. And I wanted a fresh copy. And I was able to get one, but I had to wait a couple while. Yeah, I had to keep checking back on Amazon. And sometimes it's there, sometimes it's not.
Okay. And did anybody have any other questions?
Let's see.
Did you have anything that you wanted to add that we didn't cover yet?
We talked about how long it took me. We talked about that I didn't have translation. I didn't have any training in translation.
Yeah.
We talked about
how you learned French.
Yeah. We talked about the difference. We talked about how I found the publisher. We talked about the hardest part. Yeah, I think we've covered pretty much everything.
Okay. And someone has asked, this is interesting. How are the royalties figured when there are two authors?
How does what?
Royalties. How does that work as a translator or as an author?
Well, usually that's part, the royalties are part of the contract. And usually there are royalties for both the author and the translator. And the author's royalties are higher than the translator's royalties. In this particular case, as I said, this was a first experience for both of us. We learned as we were going. And he thought because I had done all the work that I should get the royalties, and he wasn't interested in getting the royalties. But the royalties are minimal. So, anyone who knows, unless you're a very famous author or translator, it's hard to make a living or to earn a lot of money on translating or being an author.
Okay. Do you have any tips for aspiring authors or translators in this area?
Yes. Yes. The process for, especially if you're, everybody's a writer. We all have a story to tell. We all have memoirs to tell. We're all writers. But if you want to get it published and you don't want to go through the self-publishing process, which I think is a lot easier now than it was when my daughter published her first book, which, by the way, was Falling for Johnny. It's almost a historical novel. It's based on Whitey Bulger's life. But it's a lot easier now, I think, to do self-publishing than publishing. But if you are looking for a publisher, and I was fortunate through ALTA, the American Literary Translators Association, they had a database of publishers where I was able to look up publishers who published specifically French to English, what their genre was, whether they listed on the database, whether it's fiction, nonfiction, memoirs, journals, magazines, full books. All of this is listed on the database. Also their name, the company, their contact names. So I put this all on a spreadsheet, and that's how I started sending out queries. So I would recommend to aspiring authors to be published to be patient. Also, the whole process, as I explained through this, I had the readers and I had to go back and change it. I did something else, I went back and changed it. So the process is do something, put it aside, go back and look at it, make changes, put it aside again, go back, make changes, put it aside again, go back and make changes. That's the whole process. And the advice I would give to authors and to translators is to be patient and keep at it. Don't get discouraged. Don't take rejections personally, of course, and just keep at it and be patient.
Okay. And who owns the copyright? Somebody asked to this book.
The publisher has the copyright for the book. I have the copyright for the English translation for the story. But the book itself, the publisher has the copyright for that.
Okay. And I think I didn't want a second to come up with anything, but what I wanted to let someone know is I am recording this, and I will put it on our YouTube and then put a link to that on our Facebook and Twitter. And what I usually do is everyone who signed up for this, whether or not they attended, will get the link to email to them, so they'll have it if they want it. And it will be available on our Facebook and Twitter. And the book is available in clams. I can't promise that it's available right at this moment. We have a few copies, but it's requestable and it can definitely be gotten. And as she said, 8 Cousins absolutely has copies in stock that are signed, and they can get you personalized copies if you do live in
Or you
Falmouth.
can get them from me also. Also, the ebook is supposed to come out, or it was supposed to come out November 5th. But with COVID and things are going not too well in the whole publishing industry, and they've been very slow. I know you can get the ebook through Barnes and Noble. I'm not sure if you can get it through any other source right now.
Oh, good to know. And what is the French title, by the way?
The French title is Boston, un hiver si court. Now, literally, if you translate that, it's Boston, a winter too short. And we changed the title, and that was a collaborative effort with the author. I didn't think the title translated literally that way, Boston, a winter too short, actually reflected the stories in the book. So we each made up a list. I made up a list and he made up a list, and we got together and we went through, and this was his selection, what he wanted. He wanted Boston, My Blissful Winter. I wanted Memories of the 1980s. So we put the two of them together, and that's how the title came up.
Oh, that's nice. Yeah, that was neat for me to see as someone who grew up near Boston. So a lot of that was pretty familiar to me, as probably a lot of people listening to this.
Right. And as I said, one person who read the book called me right away. He loved the book. He had lived in Boston during that period of time. He said, oh my gosh, there's so much nostalgia for me. I really love the book. He said, but the nostalgia was so strong, it almost verged on the point of sadness because I missed Boston so much just reading this.
Yeah, not only Boston, but Boston the way it was then, because it's very different now in a lot of ways. Okay. Well, I guess that is probably it for now. And if anyone has any more questions, feel free to email me and I can get them to Paulette too, if we missed anything that's on your mind.
Well, thank you. Thank you to all of you who came tonight and listened to us.
Yes.
And thank you to the Falmouth Library and Vaughan.
Yeah, we've got a lot of thank yous here. And thank you for coming here. That was a wonderful thing for all our people to get to see. And have a good night, everybody. Take care. Stay warm. Bye-bye.